An elderly blind woman was abandoned in a nursing home with cruel caregivers, but when a stranger noticed what was happening, he decided to act, saving the mistreated woman's life. The sun had barely risen when David parked his worn-out car in front of the imposing Victorian mansion. The peeling paint and dusty windows contrasted with the grandeur of the architecture, as if the house was caught in a limbo between the splendor of the past and the neglect of the present. David adjusted the collar of his freshly ironed shirt, took a deep breath, and walked to the entrance. His footsteps echoed on the boards of the old porch as he approached the door. The doorbell, when rung, emitted a muffled, distant sound. Seconds passed before hurried footsteps were heard on the other side. The door opened with a creak, revealing a middle-aged woman with a stern countenance. Her eyes scanned David up and down with suspicion. "You must be the new caretaker," she said, her voice as cold as her gaze. "I'm Margaret. Come in, but don't make a sound. Mrs. Clara is resting." David nodded silently and followed Margaret inside. The interior of the house was a mosaic of shadows and diffused light, with antique furniture covered in white sheets, like silent ghosts watching their arrival. "Mrs. Clara is sensitive," Margaret continued, leading him down a narrow corridor. "She has her routines, and she doesn't like disturbances. Your job is to ensure that she remains comfortable and quiet. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am," David replied. Noticing the rigidity in Margaret's voice, something about the atmosphere made him uneasy, as if there were secrets hidden in every dark corner of the house. They arrived in a living room. In the center, sitting in a faded velvet armchair, was Clara. Her eyes, dull and unfocused, stared into the void. Soft, melancholy music emanated from an old record player in the corner of the room. "Mrs. Clara," Margaret announced, her voice suddenly sweet, almost artificial. "This is David, your new carer. He'll be here to help you from today." Clara turned her head slightly in the direction of the voice, but her eyes remained fixed on nothing. "Hello, David," she said, her voice weak, but with a touch of elegance that time had failed to erase. David approached, feeling a wave of compassion as he saw Clara's fragility. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Clara," he said softly. "I'm here to help you in any way I can." A slight smile appeared on Clara's lips, like a ray of sunshine piercing the clouds on a gray day. "What a kind voice you have, David. Welcome to my humble abode." Margaret snorted, interrupting the moment. "David, come with me. I'll show you your tasks." As he followed Margaret, David couldn't help looking back at Clara. There was something about her, a deep sadness that went beyond her physical condition, that intrigued and moved him. The next few hours were filled with meticulous instructions on Clara's routine. Margaret, along with two other carers, Thomas and Eliza, explained mealtimes, medication, and the personal care required. David noticed that, although they talked about Clara, there was a coldness in their voices, as if they were discussing the care of an object, not a human being. In the afternoon, when David returned to the living room to check on Clara, he found her still sitting in the same armchair, her delicate hands resting on her lap. He approached her quietly, not wanting to frighten her. "Mrs. Clara," he called softly. "Can I get you something? Some tea, perhaps?" Clara turned her face towards him, a fragile smile on her lips. "Oh, David, how kind of you. Tea would be lovely." As David moved to prepare the tea, Clara continued, "You know, no one has asked me what I want for a long time. It's refreshing." These words hit David like a punch in the stomach. How could they neglect someone's wishes like that? He returned with the tea, carefully guiding Clara's hands to the hot cup. "Thank you, darling," she murmured, inhaling the aroma. "Tell me about yourself, David. What brings you to this forgotten place?" David hesitated, feeling the gazes of the other caregivers on him. I've always wanted to help people," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "And I felt I could make a difference here." Clara nodded slowly. "The difference? What an interesting concept. Sometimes I wonder if it's still possible to make a difference in a life as stagnant as mine." "I believe there is always hope, Mrs. Clara," David replied, his voice laden with conviction. At that moment, Thomas entered the room abruptly. "David, Margaret needs you in the kitchen. Now." David stood up reluctantly. "I'll be back soon, Mrs. Clara." "I'll be here," she replied with a touch of irony in her voice. "Where else would I be?" In the kitchen, Margaret was waiting for him with a stern look on her face. "David, I need to remind you that we're not here to be friends with Mrs. Clara. Our job is to look after her, not to entertain her with unnecessary conversation." David felt a wave of indignation rise up inside him. But she seems so lonely. Surely a bit of company. "Enough," Margaret interrupted him. "You're new here, and you don't understand how things work. Follow the rules and don't cause trouble, understand?" David nodded. But internally, his determination only grew. There was something wrong in that house, in the way Clara was treated, and he was determined to find out what it was. At the end of the day, as the sun set and the shadows lengthened, David prepared to leave. He stopped in the living room to say goodbye to Clara. "Good night, Mrs. Clara. I'll be back tomorrow." Clara raised her face towards him, her lifeless eyes seeming to see beyond him. "Good night, David. And thank you." As he walked to his car, David couldn't get Clara out of his thoughts. The sadness in her voice, the oppressive atmosphere in the house, the cold attitude of the other carers. It all formed a disturbing puzzle that he was determined to solve. Looking at the mansion one last time before leaving, David made a silent promise. He would uncover the truth behind those dark walls and somehow bring light back into Clara's life. The sun had barely risen when David arrived at the mansion for his second day of work. The imposing structure looked even gloomier in the gray light of dawn, as if the secrets it held weighed heavily on its old foundations. Upon entering, David was greeted by the oppressive silence that seemed to be the hallmark of the place. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridors as he made his way to the kitchen to start his morning chores. "Good morning, David." Eliza's voice surprised him. The middle-aged woman with tired eyes was preparing Clara's breakfast. "I hope you're ready for another exciting day," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. David forced a smile. "Good morning, Eliza. Any special instructions for today?" Eliza shrugged. "The usual. Keep Clara quiet and comfortable. And remember, curiosity is not a virtue in this house." Eliza's words kept echoing in David's mind as he went upstairs with the breakfast tray. When he entered Clara's room, he found her already awake, sitting up in bed with her gaze lost in the direction of the window. "Good morning, Mrs. Clara," David said softly. "I've brought your breakfast." Clara turned her face towards David's voice, a slight smile forming on her lips. "Ah, David. Your voice is like a ray of sunshine in this perpetual darkness." While helping Clara with her breakfast, David couldn't help but notice a framed photograph on the bedside table. The picture showed a young Clara, her eyes bright and full of life, standing next to a distinguished-looking man. "Mrs. Clara," David began hesitantly. "If you don't mind me asking, who is the man in the photograph next to you?" Clara's face contracted for a moment, a mixture of pain and nostalgia flashing across her features. "Oh, Is that old photo still there? It's George, my late husband. We were so young and full of dreams back then. Clara's voice was lost in distant memories. David, sensing that he had touched on a delicate subject, tried to change the course of the conversation. You must have a lot of interesting stories to tell. Clara let out a bitter laugh. Oh, yes, stories of love, betrayal, and a lost fortune. But who would care about the ramblings of a blind old woman? Clara's words ignited a flame of curiosity in David. He was about to ask more questions when Thomas appeared at the bedroom door. David, Margaret needs you downstairs. Now, said Thomas, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Reluctantly, David said goodbye to Clara and followed Thomas. On his way downstairs, he couldn't help but notice the warning look the other carer was giving him. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine tasks, but David's mind was full of questions. During his lunch break, he decided to take a walk around the estate. It was then that he came across Mr. Jenkins, an elderly neighbor who was pruning the rose bushes in his garden. Oh, you must be the new caretaker, said Mr. Jenkins, his voice gruff but friendly. How's old Clara? David hesitated for a moment before answering. She seems sad. Have you known her long? Mr. Jenkins sighed, leaning on his cane. I've known Clara since she was a young girl full of life. It's a shame to see her now, trapped in that house like a caged bird. What happened to her? David couldn't contain his curiosity. Ah, young man, it's a long story, Mr. Jenkins began, his eyes straying into distant memories. Clara was the jewel of this town, intelligent, beautiful, and heir to a considerable fortune. But then came tragedy. First, the death of her husband, then the loss of her sight, and with that, people of dubious character began to circulate around her. David felt a shiver run down his spine. What kind of people? Mr. Jenkins lowered his voice. The kind who see a vulnerable woman as an opportunity. There were rumors about the family fortune mysteriously disappearing. And then, suddenly, Clara cut herself off from the world, surrounded only by these caretakers. Mr. Jenkins' words confirmed the suspicions David had been harboring. There was something deeply wrong with the situation. On returning to the mansion, David felt torn between the growing need to help Clara and the fear of the consequences his actions might bring. He found Clara in the living room, listening to an old song on the record player. David, Clara called out, sensing his presence. There's something different about you today. Your breathing is agitated. David approached, taking a seat next to her. Mrs. Clara, I'd like to understand your situation better. I feel there's a lot more to your story than I've been told. Clara was silent for a long moment, her expression a mixture of fear and hope. Oh, David, she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. There's so much I'd like to tell you, but these walls have ears, and not everyone here is trustworthy. At that moment, as if to confirm Clara's words, footsteps were heard in the corridor. Margaret entered the room, her cold gaze fixed on David. It's time for your medicine, Mrs. Clara, Margaret announced, her voice artificially sweet. Turning to David, her tone changed to something more threatening. And shouldn't you, David, be busy with your chores? David stood up, feeling the weight of Margaret's gaze. Yes, of course. I'll be right there. As he left the room, David took one last look at Clara. Her resigned expression filled him with renewed determination. He had to find out the truth, no matter what the cost. That evening, after his shift, David remained in his car parked outside the mansion. His eyes fixed on the illuminated window of Clara's room, his mind going over everything he had discovered. One thing was clear. The mystery surrounding Clara was deeper and more dangerous than he could have imagined. And now, having glimpsed the tip of the iceberg, David knew he could no longer turn back. With a determined sigh, he started the car. Tomorrow would be another day, and with it would come the chance to dig deeper, to find the answers Clara deserved. And maybe, just maybe, to bring a little light into the life of the woman fate had put in his path. Night had already fallen when David returned to the mansion, his heart heavy with the discoveries of the previous day. The dim lights emanating from the windows looked like watchful eyes, observing his every move as he approached the back door. With silent steps, David entered the kitchen. The silence of the house was broken only by the constant ticking of an old clock. He knew he shouldn't be there outside of working hours, but the need to find out the truth drove him forward. David climbed the stairs, carefully avoiding the creaking steps. In the corridor on the second floor, he stopped, alert for any sound that might indicate the presence of the other carers. Satisfied with the silence, he made his way to the room that Margaret used as an office. The door was locked, but David was prepared. With trembling hands, he used a small set of keys he had brought. After a few tense moments, the lock gave way with a soft click. The office was a heap of papers and folders. David switched on the small flashlight he had brought and began rummaging through the desk drawers. It was then that his eyes caught something interesting, a folder labeled with Clara's name. His heart racing, David opened the folder. Inside, he found financial documents, medical records, and letters. Old letters, some already yellowed by time. He picked one up and began to read, "My dear Clara, I know I promised never to contact you again, but I can't bear the weight of this secret. The truth about your family's fortune." The sound of footsteps in the corridor interrupted his reading. Panicked, David quickly put the letter back in his pocket, put his briefcase back, and switched off the flashlight. He barely had time to hide behind a heavy curtain before the door opened. Margaret entered the office, turning on the light. She seemed agitated, muttering to herself as she fiddled with some papers on the desk. David held his breath, his heart beating so loudly that he feared he might be heard. After what seemed like an eternity, Margaret finally left, leaving the office dark again. David waited a few more minutes before emerging from his hiding place, his legs shaking with adrenaline and fear. He knew he had to get out of there as quickly as possible. With quick, silent movements, David left the office, locked the door, and went downstairs. It was only when he was safely in his car, a few blocks away, that he finally allowed himself to breathe. The next morning, David arrived at work with deep circles under his eyes, but determined. The letter he had picked up burned in his pocket, a constant reminder of what was at stake. When he entered Clara's room to bring her breakfast, he found her sitting on the bed, her face turned towards the window as if she could see the world outside. "Good morning, Mrs. Clara," David said softly. Clara turned towards his voice, a sad smile on her lips. "Ah, David, you look tired today. I hope it's not because of me." David put the tray on the bedside table and sat on the edge of the bed. "Mrs. Clara, I need to ask you a few questions. It's important." Clara's face became serious. "What did you find out, David?" David carefully took the letter out of his pocket. "I found this letter. It mentions something about the truth of your family's fortune. Mrs. Clara, what really happened?" Clara was silent for a long moment, her hands shaking slightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was just a whisper. "Oh, David, it's such an old and painful story. After George died, I was so alone, so vulnerable. And then Richard came along." "Richard?" David asked. leaning forward. He was charming, caring. He said he'd look after me and the family business. I trusted him, David. I trusted him blindly. Clara paused, her voice laced with emotion. When I finally realized what was happening, it was too late. The fortune was gone, and I had lost my sight in a mysterious accident. David felt a surge of anger and compassion. What about the carers? Are they involved in this? Clara nodded slowly. Margaret was Richard's assistant. She and the others, they're here to keep me quiet, David, to make sure I never tell anyone the truth. At that moment, the bedroom door opened abruptly. Thomas was standing there, his face a mask of fury. What the hell do you think you're doing? David stood up quickly, putting himself between Thomas and Clara. The truth is coming out, Thomas. You can't keep it a secret forever. Thomas advanced menacingly. You have no idea what you're getting into, kid. Get out of here now. Or what? Clara's voice sounded surprisingly strong. Are you going to hurt me again? Make me even more isolated? That's enough, Thomas. Enough of living in the shadows. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of approaching sirens. David and Thomas exchanged looks of surprise, while Clara gave an enigmatic smile. Looks like we have visitors, Clara said calmly. David, dear, could you please open the door for the police? I think they have some questions to ask my carers. David looked at Clara, astonished. Mrs. Clara, have you... Let's just say that I've been waiting for someone like you for a long time, David, Clara replied, a glint of determination in her blind eyes. Someone who could see beyond the shadows and give me the courage to face my demons. As the sirens grew louder and the sounds of cars parking filled the air, David felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. This was only the beginning. The truth was about to come out, and with it, the promise of justice and, perhaps, redemption for Clara. With one last look at Clara, whose face now displayed a serenity that had long been absent, David headed for the front door. The morning sun was flooding the entrance hall, dispelling the shadows that had dominated the house for so long. As he opened the door to the policeman, David knew that, whatever happened next, light was finally beginning to penetrate the darkness that had enveloped Clara's life for so many years. And he was grateful to have been the catalyst for this change. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mansion's living room, now filled with police officers and investigators. David watched from a distance as Clara, sitting in her usual armchair, gave evidence to a detective with a compassionate expression. Her voice, once so fragile, now carried a tone of determination that David had never heard before. It was a nightmare that lasted years, Clara explained, her hands intertwined firmly in his lap. After George's death and the loss of my sight, I became an easy target. Richard and his accomplices not only stole my fortune, but also my freedom and dignity. The detective, a middle-aged man called Johnson, took notes as he listened intently. What about your current carers, Mrs. Hartley? What exactly was their role? Clara sighed deeply before answering. They were the guardians of my prison, Detective, Margaret, Thomas, Eliza, all hired by Richard to ensure that I remained isolated and silent. David felt a wave of nausea when he heard these words. How could anyone be so cruel? He watched as the policemen escorted Margaret and the others out of the house, their faces a mixture of anger and fear. When the last policeman left, taking with him piles of documents and evidence, a heavy silence fell over the mansion. David hesitantly approached Clara, unsure of how to proceed in this new reality. Mrs. Clara, he called softly, can I get you something? Some tea, perhaps? Clara turned her face towards him, a tired but genuine smile on her lips. Oh, David, you've done so much for me, more than you know. But yes, tea would be wonderful." As David prepared the tea in the kitchen, his mind whirled with the events of the day. The arrival of the police, the shocking confessions, the arrest of the carers. It all seemed surreal. He wondered what would happen now. Would Clara be safe? What about Richard, the man behind it all? Returning to the living room with the tea, David found Clara with her face turned towards the open window, as if trying to absorb the sounds and smells of the outside world she had been denied for so long. "You know, David," she began, accepting the cup with slightly trembling hands, "for the first time in years, I feel as if I can really breathe. It's like waking up from a long, terrible nightmare." David sat down next to her, feeling a mixture of relief and concern. "I'm glad the truth has come out, Mrs. Clara. But what happens now?" Clara took a sip of her tea before answering, her voice thoughtful. "That's the big question, isn't it? For so long, my life has been defined by this situation, by this confinement. Now that I'm free, I confess I feel a little lost." "You're not alone," David assured her, gently placing his hand on hers. "I'll be here to help you in any way I can." Clara squeezed David's hand, silent tears running down her cheeks. "You're an angel, David. I don't know how I can ever repay you for everything you've done for me." Just then, the doorbell rang, startling them both. David went to answer it, finding an elegant middle-aged woman at the door. "Hello," she said, her tone professional but kind. "I'm Sarah Lawson, a social worker. I've been assigned to assess Ms. Hartley's situation and ensure that she receives the support she needs during this transition." David felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. On the one hand, it was comforting to know that Clara would receive professional help. On the other, he couldn't help worrying about the changes this might bring. After the introductions, Sarah sat down with Clara, discussing options and next steps. David stayed close by, offering silent support and stepping in when Clara seemed overwhelmed. "Mrs. Hartley," Sarah explained gently, "given the circumstances, I believe it would be beneficial for you to spend some time in a specialized facility. There, you can receive the medical and psychological care you need to recover from this traumatic experience." Clara tensed when she heard this, her face paling. "Another institution? No. I can't. Please don't take me away from my home again." David felt his heart squeeze at Clara's obvious fear. "There must be another option," he intervened, looking at Sarah. "Maybe home care. I could continue to help if Mrs. Clara agrees." Sarah pondered for a moment before replying. "It's a possibility, but we would need to ensure that Ms. Hartley has 24-hour support, at least initially. In addition, there are legal issues to be resolved, especially considering the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of her fortune." The next few hours were a whirlwind of discussions, planning, and difficult decisions. By nightfall, an initial plan had been drawn up. Clara would remain at home, with David as her main carer, assisted by a team of health professionals who would make regular visits. When Sarah finally left, promising to return the next day with more information and resources, Clara and David found themselves alone again. The silence of the house, once oppressive, now seemed almost comforting. "David," Clara called softly, "you really don't need to do this, taking on such a responsibility." David knelt beside Clara's armchair, taking her hands in his. "Mrs. Clara, when I came to work here, it was just a job. But now it's much more than that. I promise I won't abandon you. We'll face this together." Clara smiled, tears of gratitude shining in her blind eyes. "Oh, David, you really are a light in the shadows of my life." As the day drew to a close, David reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. The road ahead would be long and challenging, he knew. There would be legal, emotional, and practical obstacles to overcome. The shadow of Richard and the missing money still hung over them. But looking at Clara, seeing the new hope that lit up her face, David felt a deep certainty. No matter what the future held, they would face it together. And in the process, perhaps they would both find the healing and redemption they so longed for. Dawn brought a different atmosphere to the Hartley mansion. The curtains, once perpetually closed, now let in the golden light of the rising sun. David, who had been sleeping on the sofa in the living room, woke up to the smell of fresh coffee. Confused, he got up quickly and headed for the kitchen, only to find Clara carefully groping through the cupboards. "Mrs. Clara?" he called softly, so as not to startle her. "What are you doing?" Clara turned towards his voice, a hesitant smile on her lips. "Good morning, David. I thought I'd try making the coffee today. It's been so long since I've done anything for myself." David felt a surge of emotion when he saw the determination in Clara's lifeless eyes. "That's wonderful. Can I help?" Together, they navigated the kitchen, David gently guiding Clara's hands as she measured the coffee, filled the kettle with water, and turned on the appliance. The comforting aroma soon filled the room, bringing a sense of normality that had long been absent. As they sipped their coffee, Clara spoke, her voice a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You know, David, last night, after you fell asleep, I was thinking. For years, I've lived like a prisoner in my own home. Now that I'm free, I realize that I don't know how to live anymore." David placed his cup on the table, choosing his words carefully. "It's understandable, Mrs. Clara. You've been through a lot. But you're not alone on this journey. We'll take it one step at a time." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah, the social worker, accompanied by a man in a suit who introduced himself as lawyer Daniel Morris. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartley, Mr. David," Sarah greeted. "I hope you've had a good rest. We have a lot to discuss today." The next few hours were filled with intense conversations about the next steps. Lawyer Morris explained the legal complexity of the situation. "The investigation into the disappearance of your fortune is ongoing, Mrs. Hartley," he informed her. "Richard and his accomplices are being sought, but the process could be lengthy. In the meantime, we need to ensure your safety and well-being." Clara squeezed David's hand, seeking support. "What about my house? My possessions?" Morris hesitated before answering. "Unfortunately, many of your assets have been liquidated or transferred illegally. We're working to recover what we can, but, well, things could get complicated for a while." David felt the tension grow in Clara's body. "But she won't be helpless, right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Sarah intervened. "Absolutely not. There are assistance programs and resources available, and with Mr. David here as her primary caregiver, along with the healthcare team that will be coming in regularly, we will ensure that Ms. Hartley receives all the support she needs." The meeting continued, discussing practical details, medical appointments, therapy, adaptations to the house for greater accessibility. Clara listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, but David could sense her growing anxiety. When Sarah and Morris finally left, promising to return soon with more updates, a heavy silence fell over the room. "David!" Clara called out, her voice trembling. "Are you still there?" "I'm here, Mrs. Clara," he replied promptly, moving to sit beside her. "How are you feeling?" Clara let out a deep sigh. "Overwhelmed, grateful, but scared. Everything is changing so fast, and there's so much to do, so many decisions to make." David gently took her hand. "I know it seems scary now, but remember, you don't have to face this alone." We're in this together." Clara squeezed his hand, silent tears running down her cheeks. "Oh, David, how can I thank you for everything you're doing? You hardly know me, and yet you're here, bearing all this burden with me." "It's not a burden, Mrs. Clara," David replied softly. "It's a privilege to be able to help you rebuild your life, to see your strength and courage. It gives me a purpose I've never had before." The rest of the day was dedicated to small but meaningful tasks. David helped Clara reorganize her room, describing each object as they moved it, allowing her to get reacquainted with her space. They opened long-closed drawers, discovering forgotten treasures, old photos, letters, small mementos of a life Clara thought she had lost forever. In the evening, exhausted but satisfied with the day's progress, they sat on the balcony, feeling the gentle evening breeze. "David," Clara began, hesitantly, "there's something I'd like to try. Something I haven't done for years." "What is it, Mrs. Clara?" I'd like to play the piano. There's one in the music room, covered up for so long. Would you help me get there?" David carefully guided Clara into the dusty music room. Together, they removed the cloth covering the grand piano. David watched, thrilled, as Clara slid her fingers over the keys, getting reacquainted with the instrument. And then, to David's surprise and delight, Clara began to play. The notes, initially hesitant, soon flowed into a sweet, melancholy melody. It was as if years of silence and pain were being released through the music. David stood motionless, amazed at Clara's transformation. Her face, normally tense and worried, was now serene, almost radiant. The music filled the house, chasing away the last shadows of the dark past. As the last note faded into the air, Clara smiled, tears of joy in her eyes. "Thank you, David," she whispered, "for helping me find my music again." At that moment, watching Clara at the piano, David felt a deep certainty. The road ahead would be challenging, full of legal, emotional, and practical obstacles. The shadow of Richard and the past still hung over them. But with every small victory, every moment of rediscovered joy, they were moving forward. Clara was taking her first steps out of the darkness that had imprisoned her for so long, and David was determined to be by her side every step of the way. The weeks passed, bringing with them a new routine for the Hartley mansion. David watched, with a mixture of admiration and concern, as Clara struggled daily to regain her independence. Every small victory, from learning to navigate the house unaided to relearning how to perform simple everyday tasks, was celebrated. But David couldn't help noticing the growing weariness in Clara's eyes. One particularly difficult morning, after Clara had accidentally knocked over a cup of tea, David found her sitting on the kitchen floor, silent tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Clara," he said softly, kneeling down beside her. "It's all right. Accidents happen." Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. "It's not just that, David. It's everything. Sometimes I feel like I'm trying to climb an endless mountain. Every step is a struggle." David felt his heart squeeze. Carefully, he helped Clara to her feet and guided her into the living room. Taking a seat next to her on the sofa, he held her hands gently. "Mrs. Clara, look how far you've come. A month ago, you hardly left your room. Now you're relearning how to live. It's normal to feel overwhelmed sometimes." Clara sighed deeply. "You're right, of course. It's just that sometimes the memories of the past seem so vivid. I remember who I was before all this, and the distance between that Clara and who I am now seems insurmountable." Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting the conversation. David went to answer it, finding Detective Johnson at the door, his face grave. "Good morning, mister." David, I need to speak to Mrs. Hartley. We have some news about the investigation. David's heart raced. He guided the detective into the living room, noticing how Clara straightened up when she heard the newcomer's voice. Mrs. Hartley, the detective began, taking a seat opposite her. We have good news and bad news. The good news is that we've managed to trace some of the funds that were embezzled from your account. We're working to recover them. Clara nodded slowly. And the bad news, Detective? Johnson hesitated for a moment before continuing. Richard has been spotted in the city. We believe he's trying to access some of the hidden resources before fleeing the country. David felt Clara stiffen beside him. Richard's name hung in the air like a dark cloud, bringing with it painful memories and long-suppressed fears. Does he know I'm free? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We believe so, Johnson replied gravely. Mrs. Hartley, we need to consider the possibility that he might try to contact you or, worse. David felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him. What can we do to keep Mrs. Clara safe? The next few hours were spent discussing security measures. Cameras would be installed around the property, and an officer would stand guard at night. David offered to stay full-time at the mansion, a suggestion that Clara accepted with obvious gratitude. When the detective finally left, Clara looked exhausted. David helped her settle into her favorite armchair, draping a blanket over her shoulders. David, she called softly, would you mind reading to me? There's a book of poetry on the shelf. It was George's favorite. David picked up the aforementioned book, an old volume with a leather cover. Sitting down next to Clara, he began to read. The words flowed smoothly, filling the room with images of love, loss, and hope. As he read, David couldn't help but reflect on his own journey. When he had taken this job, he could never have imagined where it would take him. Now, he found himself deeply involved in Clara's life, determined to protect her at all costs. His thoughts were interrupted by a gentle touch on his arm. Clara had fallen asleep, her face looking peaceful for the first time in weeks. David closed the book quietly, allowing himself a moment to observe her. That night, while Clara slept, David made a round of the house, checking every window and door. Richard's threat hung over them like an ominous shadow. Standing in front of a window, staring into the darkness outside, David felt an iron determination forming inside him. He would protect Clara, no matter what the cost. Not just from external threats, but also from the inner demons that still haunted her. Together, they would confront the echoes of the past and build a better future. The next day, Clara surprised David by suggesting a walk in the garden. I can't live in fear forever, she said, her voice carrying a new strength. Richard has already robbed me of too many years of my life. Walking slowly through the abandoned garden, Clara shared memories of happier times. Of George, of her life before the tragedy. David listened intently, amazed at the resilience of this woman who, despite everything, still found beauty in the world. You know, David, Clara said, pausing to touch a long-neglected rosebush. For years, I thought my life was over, that all I had left were memories and regrets. But now I feel like I'm waking up from a long sleep. David smiled, although Clara couldn't see it. I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Clara, you deserve this second chance. Clara turned towards him, her face serious. And I owe a lot of that to you, David. Your kindness, your patience. You gave me back hope when I thought it was lost forever. The moment was interrupted by the sound of an approaching car. David immediately became alert, placing himself protectively in front of Clara. To his relief, it was only Sarah, the social worker, arriving for her weekly visit. But the brief moment of panic served as a sharp reminder. Danger was still out there, waiting. As he guided Clara back to the house, David made a silent promise. He would do everything in his power to ensure that Clara could live her life to the full, free from the fear and shadows of the past. The journey would be long and challenging, but together, they would find their way to the light. Night fell over the Hartley mansion, bringing with it a tense stillness. David, unable to sleep, found himself wandering the corridors, his thoughts a whirlwind of worries and plans. Then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from Clara's room. Approaching silently, he heard her murmuring in her sleep, words laced with fear and supplication. David hesitated at the door, torn between his desire to comfort Clara and his respect for her privacy. Finally, he decided to enter, calling her name softly. Clara woke up startled, her blind eyes wide with panic. "Richard? Is that you?" "No, Mrs. Clara, it's me, David," he replied quickly, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "It's all right. It was just a bad dream." Clara calmed down at the sound of his voice, silent tears streaming down her face. "Oh, David, I'm so sorry. I dreamt that Richard had come back, that it was all just an illusion, and I was still trapped." David gently took her hand. "It was just a dream. You're safe now. I promise." They stayed like that for a long moment, the silence of the night broken only by Clara's soft breathing. David felt a wave of conflicting emotions, compassion, anger at what Clara had suffered, and something else, something he wasn't yet ready to name. "David," Clara finally spoke, her voice little more than a whisper. "Would you stay here with me, just until I fall asleep again?" "Of course," he replied softly, settling into the chair beside the bed. As Clara slowly drifted back to sleep, David reflected on how complex his situation had become. He had started out as a simple carer, but now he was Clara's protector, her confidant, perhaps even her friend. And as the first rays of the sun began to penetrate through the curtains, David made another silent promise. No matter what the future held, what challenges Richard or the world might throw at them, he would be by Clara's side. Together, they would face the echoes of the past and build a new tomorrow. Autumn had arrived, painting the garden of the Hartley mansion in shades of gold and red. Clara, sitting in her rocking chair on the veranda, breathed deeply of the fresh morning air. David watched her from afar, amazed at the transformation he had witnessed over the last few months. "A penny for your thoughts," Clara said softly, turning her face towards David. He moved closer, smiling. "I was just thinking about how you seem at peace today." Clara nodded, a serene smile on her lips. "You know, David, for the first time in years, I feel like I'm really living, not just existing, and I owe a lot of that to you." The moment was interrupted by the sound of the phone ringing inside the house. David answered it quickly, his body tense as he recognized Detective Johnson's voice. "David, we have a situation," Johnson said, his voice urgent. "Richard has been spotted nearby. We believe he may try something today. We're on our way, but stay alert." David's heart raced. He thanked the detective and hung up, turning quickly to Clara. "Ms. Clara," he began, trying to keep his voice calm. "We need to get inside, now." Clara immediately noticed the tension in his voice. "It's him, isn't it? Richard's coming?" David helped her up, guiding her into the house. "Don't worry, I'll keep you safe. I promise." They had barely entered when they heard the sound of breaking glass at the back of the house. David quickly locked the front door and guided Clara into the study, the safest room in the mansion. "Stay here," he whispered, positioning Clara behind the heavy desk. "I'll check and call the police." "David, no!" Clara grabbed his arm, fear evident in her voice. "Don't leave me alone, please." At that moment, they heard footsteps in the corridor. The office door opened violently, revealing Richard, the man who had caused Clara so much pain. Well, Richard said, a cruel smile on his face. "What a touching scene." David stood protectively in front of Clara. "Get out of here, Richard. The police are on their way." Richard laughed, brandishing a gun. "Do you really think I'm afraid of the police? I've come for what's mine." "Nothing here is yours," Clara said, her voice surprisingly firm. She stood up slowly, putting a hand on David's shoulder. "You've already taken everything from me once, Richard. I won't let you do it again." Richard stepped forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "Don't you understand, Clara? All of this," he gestured around, "should be mine. I deserved this life, not you." David felt Clara squeeze his shoulder. In that touch, he felt all the strength and determination she had rediscovered in recent months. "You're wrong, Richard," Clara replied calmly. "This life, this house, they're mine. Not because I inherited them, but because I fought to get them back. Every day, every moment of pain and fear I fought. And now, I'm no longer afraid of you." Clara's words seemed to knock Richard off balance for a moment. His hand with the gun trembled slightly. David took advantage of this moment of hesitation. In one swift movement, he advanced on Richard, grabbing his armed arm. The two men struggled, the gun between them. Clara, unable to see the struggle but hearing the sounds of confrontation, moved carefully around the room, guided by memory and sound. She reached for her late husband's old walking stick, hanging on the wall. A gunshot echoed through the room. David felt a sharp pain in his shoulder, but didn't let go of Richard. At the same moment, Clara struck with surprising precision, hitting Richard's legs with the cane. Richard fell, the weapon slipping from his hand. David, ignoring the pain, quickly immobilized him. Just then, sirens sounded outside. The police had arrived. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Police officers burst into the house. Richard was led away in handcuffs, and paramedics attended to David's wound. When the dust finally settled, David and Clara found themselves alone again in the study. Clara gently groped David's bandaged arm. "Are you really all right?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. David covered her hand with his. "I'm fine, Mrs. Clara. Thanks to you. You were amazing." Clara let out a shaky laugh. "I guess I still have a few tricks up my sleeve after all." They were silent for a moment, the weight of the day's events hanging over them. "David," Clara finally spoke, her voice soft. "I think it's time we made some changes." "What kind of changes?" David asked, curious. Clara smiled, a glint of determination in her blind eyes. "First, I think you should just call me Clara. After everything we've been through together, formalities seem a bit inappropriate." David felt his heart racing. "Clara," he said, testing the name. "I'd like that. And secondly," she continued, "I think it's time we actually lived, not just survived. What do you say we redecorate this old house? Maybe even open it up for charity events." David smiled, feeling a surge of affection and admiration for this incredible woman. "I think that's a wonderful idea." Clara. In the weeks that followed, the Hartley mansion took on new life. The heavy curtains were replaced by light fabrics that let the light in. The garden, so long neglected, flourished under the care of Clara and David. Clara, with the help of Sarah, the social worker, started a foundation to help victims of abuse. The mansion became a place of healing and hope, not just for Clara, but for many others. One sunny afternoon, while Clara played the piano in the music room, David reflected on the extraordinary journey they had shared. From reluctant carer to friend, confidant, and perhaps something more, he had witnessed Clara's rebirth. Clara stopped playing, turning towards David with a smile. "Come and sit here with me," she invited, patting the piano bench. David obeyed, taking a seat next to her. Clara found his hand, intertwining their fingers. "You know, David," she said softly, "for a long time, I thought my life was over, that all I had left were shadows and painful memories. But you showed me that there is always light, even in the deepest darkness." David felt tears well up in his eyes. "Clara, you did it alone. I was just here to support you." Clara shook her head, smiling. "No, David, we did it together, and I hope we continue to do it together for a long time." At that moment, with the afternoon sun bathing the room in golden hues and the music still echoing in the air, David understood. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. Clara had found her light amidst the shadows, and in the process had become David's light too. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting out of pain and darkness. And as Clara began to play again, her music filling the house with notes of hope and renewal, David knew that this was not the end of one story, but the beginning of another, a story of love, healing, and the transformative power of compassion. The Hartley mansion, once a symbol of isolation and pain, now pulsed with life and possibilities. And at the center of it all were Clara and David, two hearts that had found each other in the darkness and, together, had rediscovered the light. Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.